Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Monday. We have a great show for you. Alyssa, what do we have?
Malika Jabali and Philip Wegman join us for Team Rising to discuss the latest on the pending Purdue Pharma settlement. And Kim Ives is back with us. He'll discuss the murder of the Haitian legal clerk that was involved in the probe of President Jovenel Moïse's assassination. But first, nearly 2 decades after the U.S. invaded Afghanistan, the nation's capital has fallen back under Taliban control.
Ghani was reportedly set to participate in the transition of power ceremony inside the palace, but instead fled the country. Professor at John Jay College, City University of New York, Christian Parenti, joins us now to weigh in on what has been happening. So, Christian, you spent a lot of time in Afghanistan reporting for The Nation and other outlets in the 2000s. And if you don't even have to squint too much at the reporting you were doing then to see this unfolding as it did. So can you talk a little bit about what structurally did you find in Afghanistan that you think led up to this rapid collapse once the U.S. left?
The problem is really two things. First, it was the empowerment of the warlord class. These are the leaders of the Mujahideen terrorist movement that the U.S., Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan supported in their war against the Soviet Union. And when the Soviets withdrew and then 3 years later the Afghan nationalist government collapsed, the Mujahideen warlords took over. They set to fighting among themselves, destroyed the country during the 90s. The Taliban arose out of that chaos. When the U.S. goes in, one of the main problems was that the Mujahideen warlords were empowered to control the government. And they then proceeded to just use the Afghan government as a cash cow. I mean, they're very, very corrupt. Karzai's anti-corruption chief was a man who had done time in a Nevada prison for drug dealing. So these are our allies. That's problem number one. And then the other problem was this commitment to using private sector methods for reconstruction. That meant that the vast majority of reconstruction money that the U.S. spent, taxpayer money, went to private for-profit corporations and for-profit NGOs, the Beltway bandits that do most of the contracting for USAID. So that led to naked corruption, like basically overcharging and under-delivering, and then also soft corruption of high-paid, well-meaning technocrats going around writing reports, staying in fancy hotels, having large staff. These two problems meant that very little money hit the ground. That meant that there was no economic improvement for the average Afghan farmer person. And that meant their resentments grew and grew, and that then was fertile soil for the Taliban to come back. And the Taliban would say, look, we're going to take on this corrupt government. They send in these corrupt cops to shake you down, to destroy your poppy crop. We'll stop all that. We will impose an uncorrupt religious government. And in the face of the total failure of development because of the control of the warlords and because of this total commitment to the private sector as a method, more and more people started siding with the Taliban.
And Christian, this is fascinating perspective, and I appreciate you taking us back a bit. Let me ask you, there's a sense within the national security community that the Taliban among terrorist entities are more moderate. In Afghanistan, you've got a whole host of different terrorist elements, whether it's ISIS-K, the Haqqani network, the remnants of al-Qaeda. What do you predict going out from here? What is the state of the country? Does the Taliban rule with an iron fist? Are we expecting to see Sharia law implemented left and right? And I would also add to that, do you think these other terror elements that exist in the country are going to have a greater foothold, or will the Taliban maintain control?
Well, I'm not on the ground, so to some extent that's hard to say, but definitely the Taliban is already imposing Sharia law, and they do have a harsh rule. I think one factor that is going to reemerge is ethnic conflict. The Taliban is not just a religious movement, it's very much a Pashtun movement. The Pashtun are the largest ethnic group in Afghanistan. They're about 42% of the population, and all the other ethnic groups are smaller. And there has always been a conflict between the Pashtun and other groups. Pashtun generally control the south and certain parts of the north. So At the moment, the old warlords of the Tajik, the Uzbek, the Hazara have been driven away, but they will probably regroup and an ethnic war will return. A number of Pashtun Mujahideen parties have joined the Taliban, for example, Hezb-e Islami under Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. I don't know whether the Taliban can control a movement and a character as powerful as that. So I doubt that Afghanistan is going to be stable. I think there's going to be continued warfare, and where the Taliban have control, they're going to impose a very harsh rule, as they did in the 90s. The only upside to that is that maybe there will be no civil war in some of those areas, because to some extent, the only thing worse, this is why the Taliban supports it. The only thing worse than that kind of despotism is a horrible, sadistic civil war with seemingly no end.
Christian, yesterday we saw U.S. military helicopters whisk away American embassy staff ahead of evacuation from the country. A frantic rush by thousands of foreigners and Afghans to flee to safety as well. You can see this here, how many people are trying to get on board. It's reported that U.S. officials are considering evacuating Afghans who provided assistance to U.S. forces, but they don't have visas to holding locations while their applications are being assessed. Can you give us some insight of who you think these people are that are actually trying to flee the country? I mean, we're seeing thousands. It's a country of 38 million. So who are these people in particular?
Well, I worked with a guy named Ajmal Naqshbandi, a fixer who was later kidnapped and murdered by the Taliban. His brother is one of these people. He's at the airport trying to get his family out. They're primarily people who have worked with the foreign forces or have worked in the NGO sector trying to modernize Afghanistan. They're part of the urban middle and working classes who for 100 years have been trying to achieve development. First under kind of constitutional monarchy, then under sort of a nationalist government, then under Soviet-style communism, then under the U.S.-led occupation. There's an element in Afghan society in the cities that have literally for 100 years been trying to achieve development, and that's the kind of person who is in the airport right now. And the U.S., the minimum the U.S. owes is to try and get those people out of there after they put their good faith in this effort and have been left high and dry.
And watching this collapse over the weekend, I thought back to a scene from your documentary Fixer, about the fixer and interpreter that you just mentioned, where you and him wanted to kind of get a recording, wanted to film a court setting, some type of a hearing, so you could see how those were developing. And that entire scene now feels like a metaphor for everything that went wrong, or everything that was designed to go wrong in Afghanistan. Can you give people a little background about that particular scene?
Yeah, we wanted to film a court proceeding, in part because Ajmal, the fixer who was murdered by the Taliban, was being shaken down by a judge. So we were trying to kind of capture that whole thing. And there proceeded then this very elaborate but kind of awkward trial. And we could tell by the end of it that this wasn't real. And at the end of filming this, Ajmal stopped one of the lawyers and was like, "This was not real." And actually, because what happens is the judge very summarily convicts the criminal, who then gets up and walks out, because he was like a janitor in the court who had been recruited. And it just showed how habituated, not the rank and file people, but the leadership, these mujahideen thugs and drug dealers who had been empowered by the U.S., they were totally habituated to just taking money and then propping up some flimsy little charade and pretending that they were actually trying to build a functional state and deliver services to the people of Afghanistan, which they in fact had no intention of doing whatsoever.
It's just awful. So the U.S. sent thousands of troops back into the country temporarily to safeguard what was gearing up to be a large-scale airlift. According to NPR, the United States announced late last night that it was taking charge of air traffic control at the airport. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan went on ABC this morning to discuss the situation and pointed to the Afghan government's failure to fight back against the Taliban. Let's watch.
Well, the president did not think it was inevitable that the Taliban were going to take control of Afghanistan. He thought the Afghan National Security Forces could step up and fight because we spent 20 years, tens of billions of dollars training them, giving them the best equipment, giving them support of U.S. forces for 20 years. And when push came to shove, they decided not to step up and fight for their country. And so the question facing the president back in April, and again as we've gone forward, is should U.S. men and women be put into the middle of another country's civil war when their own army won't fight to defend them?
Christian, let me ask you, the question on everyone's mind, how after 20 years and $1 trillion were the Afghan security forces so ill-equipped and unprepared to fight?
It has to do with the use of the private sector to deliver a lot of these services. I mean, enormous amounts of overbilling by the companies like DynCorp that were helping with the training. And it has to do, as I said earlier, with the empowerment of this warlord class. These are the rebels who fought the Soviet Union. And during the 80s, the U.S. gave them billions of dollars while they dealt drugs and destroyed the country, Afghanistan. So they were re-empowered, and they just stole openly. So as a result, there's very low morale and very low levels of training. We know the Afghan people can do better than that. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the Afghan government under Mohammad Najibullah held on for 3 more years until the Yeltsin government cut off aid. But the problem was this dependence on the private sector and the dependence on this class of elite warlords who really had no intention of building an army, no intention of building a state, but were on the take the whole time. And then the best intentions of all the rank and file Afghan people who threw their lives and their souls into this project of reconstruction for 20 years, their morale was badly damaged when they saw that their leadership was stealing, and then when it became clear that the U.S. was just going to abandon them. And I'm not suggesting that the U.S. should have stayed in Afghanistan forever, but we just shouldn't be surprised that when the force that's propping it all up announces very clearly that it's leaving, that people are going to panic and flee.
That's a very important point. So former President Trump also criticized the Biden administration, saying that Biden should resign for, quote, what he has allowed to happen in Afghanistan.
Okay.
Ryan, also
Why does he have to resign? I thought Trump was about to get inaugurated, so he's gonna be forced out. Anyway, Christian, I don't know. One last question while we have you. You had mentioned that after the Soviet Union left Afghanistan, the kind of nationalist-ish government that remained in its place, Najibullah's regime, lasted another 3 years. So what was it about that administration that allowed it to hold on for 3 years after its kind of foreign backer left, whereas ours lasted a matter of weeks?
The main difference would be a real commitment to development. It's not like there weren't, it was an authoritarian regime. There was, serious kind of, police state elements to it, but it was also actually committed to development and had delivered meaningful economic change to people, and that's what won the loyalty of particularly the populations in the cities, which held on to the very end. It's because the money wasn't by and large stolen. It was manifest as clean drinking water, jobs with decent wages, and a general improvement in the standard of living for people.
This is a radical approach. I don't know. Maybe we should try that sometime. Not so sure. Christian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you,
Christian.
We'll tell you what's on our radars. That's up next.